And I'm hoping everybody can see my screen right now. I'm sure I'll hear it if you can't. But before we get started, before we launch into this, what I'd like everybody to do is to grab a pen and a piece of paper if you have one, and I'd like you to write down 3 numbers, and those numbers are 80, 17, and 5. If you don't have a pen and piece of paper, that's okay. Just hold those numbers in your head. But I am going to tell you what they mean. So a few years ago, I think we all remember that there was a lot of buzz around a new stat that came out stating that buyers are 57% of the way through the buying process before they ever meet with a seller. And a couple years later, that number crept up to 67%, and it's been edging up more and more ever since. And according to recent experts, now you see about 80% of the sales cycle is now regularly taking place in digital or remote settings. Probably more than that, more like 100% now with COVID, but kind of regularly it's that 80% number. And then last year, Gartner also released a statistic showing that when B2B buyers are considering a purchase, they spend only 17% of their time meeting with potential suppliers. So what that means to you, if you are a vendor, is that you're only getting, if you're a vendor and you're in the typical 3-vendor bake-off process, you're only getting about 5% of your customers' attention during that for your seller conversations. So what this is telling us, what all these stats are telling us, is that buyers are moving in and out of different channels all the time. They're just not that interested in interacting with you in person. And for those of us who have been around long enough to remember when sales and marketing alignment was a thing, I think what we're looking at now is something that's more like sales and marketing convergence, where you really don't know where marketing ends and sales begins. And I'm a marketer. I know that has profound implications for my role. Scott, what about you?
Yeah, I think that we see that throughout the process now. I've always relied on marketing to help us from a prospect identification or net new focus, but now we are one team. And it's critical that, we stay on point with that message to get the maximum amount of value through both the marketing and sales process.
Yeah. And so here's another way to look at this. So, as a marketer, I know that I and those of you who are marketers on this call as well, we've spent most of our time up here at the top of the funnel. So we create awareness, we run campaigns, those campaigns generate interest, and then usually at some point there's some sort of handoff to sales, who then drives the customer through to the decision. But I think one of the things that we see through the stats I just shared is that digital marketing, changing buyer preferences have now pushed marketing farther down the funnel. So now marketing is doing the nurture campaigns to keep leads warm. We're doing targeted campaigns to reignite cold leads. We're doing buyer enablement campaigns to help buyers organize themselves to make purchases. And marketing owns all of that. Marketing is also coming to own a bigger chunk of the sales process as well. So whether you're calling them LDRs, BDRs, SDRs, whatever you call your business development function, more and more that is rolling over to marketing. And in fact, industry leaders now believe that soon about 50% of sales enablement will now report to marketing. And that means that marketing is actually taking buyers all the way through straight down to the point of decision. And there's a good reason for this. So again, the reason for this is that marketing skill is all about creating content and processes. And if you're driving a digital buying journey, you need systematized content and processes to fully support that journey. But there's also more to the story, because there's also a secondary funnel. And this is what we call the expansion funnel. So in addition to taking more responsibility for customer acquisition, marketing is also getting much more involved in customer marketing. And what I mean by customer marketing is expanding business with existing customers. So it's marketing that's running renewal cadences, it's marketing that's running the upsell cadences, it's marketing that's creating the QBR decks, and managing programs to ensure that they're doing everything they can to help customers organize themselves to make additional buying decisions. And Scott, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we as marketers live and die by the number of MQLs that we deliver to sales. And then it's still, in some cases, kind of a toss over the wall because sales is now, on a mission to execute their selling process. And what we're talking about here is aligning them to the messaging through the entire buying process. And so the sales development effort to convert leads to what is typically known as an SQL, that focus is all about driving to the next step and tends to lose, what we're talking about today, which is that message of continuity, the memorable points of that message. And at that point, research indicates that it's going to take another 10 to 15 touches just to get the conversation with that quote unquote MQL. And I see that in most cases, sales only makes 4 attempts, which is significantly short of 15. So I think that validates the move for marketing to continue into the funnel and further down, as you indicate here.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And when we talk about those buying decisions, what research shows is that the #1 factor driving buying decisions today is memory. So your marketing touches your buyer at one point in time, but they make the decision to buy later. And unfortunately, too much of what marketing does today is forgettable. So when the customer comes time to make that decision, they actually have forgotten your content, forgotten your message. And by the way, marketing knows this. So we did a survey a few months ago, and in our survey, we found out that only 25% of marketers are confident or highly confident that their marketing materials are in fact memorable. So one of the things that we wanted to look a little deeper at is what's going wrong. So why is so much marketing so utterly forgettable? And what we found is that there's actually 4 problem areas that are impacting marketing memorability, beginning with, as Scott and I have talking about is the message. So if you are not marketing based on your buyer's specific situational context, and I'm not talking about personas here, and we'll talk more about that in just a second, you're not going to be presenting your message to the buyers in the right way. So it becomes forgettable. If the content that you create with that message isn't focused, it doesn't have that crisp, well-articulated idea, your audiences are not going to remember what you want them to remember. If you're not populating that content with well-designed visuals, your audience is going to notice them enough to act on them. And unless you have a compelling narrative that speaks to the decision-making part of the brain, your story and your brand just get lost in the crowd and the flood of additional messages that your buyers, your audiences are getting. So what does this mean? If marketing is driving decisions and memory is a key factor in those decisions, then it stands to reason, it follows that you need to make your marketing memorable. And so what does that mean? That means #1, developing situational specific messages based on your buyer's psychology. It means creating unforgettable content that gets audiences to focus on what you want them to focus on. It means designing visuals that persuade your buyers to act. And it means building stories for memory, decision, and action. And so we're going to talk about all of these things in detail in just a second. Scott, I didn't know if you had anything else that you wanted to add here.
Well, interestingly enough, I had the pleasure of taking a corporate visions course quite some time ago. And that memorable piece has to continue through the sales process. Consider the number of buyers in a buying committee now. You've got different people, different roles, different methods of the way they remember things. And so if you can continue with the pieces that are memorable, you have a chance of differentiating yourself. I mean, most of the people on the phone have been a buyer at some point. And if it was, for example, a software purchase, you've had demonstrations. And at the end of 3 or 4 demonstrations, they kind of all blur together. And it's the folks that actually created significant, positive, memorable events that you're going to probably gravitate towards in your final bake-off.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's talk about messaging, because that's, in my opinion, that's where creating memorable marketing starts. And in our survey, one of the things that we discovered is that 53% of the marketers that we surveyed admit that they lack a formal process for actually developing messages. Now, 77% of them said it would be a really good idea, it would be important or very important to have one, but more than half don't have one. And that's a problem because messages are getting created all over your organization. Now, we've said before, marketing is at every stage of the buying process, but that doesn't mean that sales and customer success aren't having their own conversations with buyers and existing customers as well. And each one is going to bring their own distinct approach to each of those areas, but those distinct approaches are often separate and different. And even though each group is supposed to be communicating with the same customers, they're often saying the same thing in different ways. And Scott, I know you and I talked about this in the run-up to the webinar.
Yeah, given the Pedowitz group does a focus on operations, you have to remember that these three groups are probably operating on three different systems, 2 to 3, maybe even more different technologies. And so that's how that message begins to, denigrate. You have the telephones on the screen. It's, you remember the old game of telephone tag. If the handoff isn't actually congruent with what sales should be saying, and then vice versa over to the customer success area, that continuity of message gets lost and is rarely recorded in any type of system. As we know, our sales brethren, hesitate to actually record that amount of detail in their CRM. And then customer success typically operates in their own database with completely different metrics. And these three groups are measured differently. The KPIs are different, and continuity gets lost.
Yeah. And continuity gets lost, and that's where you can see that this creates a real problem, because your customers are going to be getting mixed messages all the way up to the point of decision. And when that happens, your leads never close. It means that prospects can just get so confused that they abandon the process entirely. And it gets even worse when marketing starts sending those great, disruptive, challenging campaigns, provocative campaigns to existing customers that sales is trying to renew. And as a result of that, those existing customers either won't renew their contracts or they won't buy new solutions from you. So how do you fix this? So you fix this through science. So creating memorable messages begins with understanding buyer psychology. And it means following that buyer psychology versus following your gut. Means knowing what message to deliver based on your buyer situation, whether they're a new prospect or an existing customer, and then acting accordingly. And here's what I mean by that. So most organizations take a one-size-fits-all approach to customer messaging, the way they communicate and articulate value. But there's actually two major moves that are distinct in the way that you should be communicating and articulating value. The first is customer acquisition, and the second is customer expansion. And again, most people think that these are the same moves and they use one-size-fits-all messages and content for both of those motions, but they're not the same. Because what the science says and what our research shows is that people frame value and make choices completely differently based on whether they're a customer or whether they are just a prospect. And in fact, it's 180 degrees in either direction. So your ability to articulate value is directly linked to your understanding and ability to execute against both of these situations. And this is all driven by science, by this piece of science that's known as status quo bias. And what status quo bias says is that people are reluctant to change their minds. And in fact, they will do everything possible to avoid change if they don't have to. So when you are in the motion of trying to acquire a new prospect, your job as a seller, as a marketer, is to defeat their status quo bias. And you do that by making a case for change and making a case for immediate change by answering those why change, why now questions. But when you're the incumbent, when you are the status quo, the last thing in the world you want to do is disrupt yourself. Here you want to defend your status quo. You want to defend your incumbency. You want to reinforce their status quo bias. And you do that by delivering a message to get them to stay if all you want them to do is buy the same thing from you over and over again, or to evolve if you want them to buy new stuff from you. So I'm going to take you through the choreographies that you'd follow to create these messages. And then Scott, I'll circle back with you because I know that you have worked with us on creating messages, so I'm interested in your perspective on this. But when you're in a why change scenario, you want to create the case for change. And you do this first and foremost by surfacing what we call an unconsidered need. And an unconsidered need is simply a problem that is unknown, underappreciated, or unmet in some way with your prospect. So in other words, it could be something they didn't see coming, a problem they're aware of, but they don't think is important enough to solve, or a problem that they think that they're already fixing by working with a competitor or using workarounds. Now, what you'll hear from me is that it is really hard to come up with a truly unknown need. If you can come up with one, if you can find one, take it and run with it as fast as you can to the bank, because that is messaging gold. It's going to be far more likely that what you're going to come up with are going to be underappreciated or unmet needs. And it's your job in those instances, whether you're a seller, whether you're a marketer, to get your audience to care about what you want them to care about, to create that discomfort for their status quo. And the next thing that you're going to do in this message is you're going to show them that their current approach for solving that need is flawed in some way. And, you know, because if they're not buying your thing, they are obviously adopting a flawed approach. The trick for marketers is to not call the baby ugly, right? Like you don't want to insult them by, you know, telling them all the mistakes that they've made. But what you do want to do, you know, kind of logically, consultatively, is to point out the vulnerabilities they're exposed to, and then help them realize for themselves that they need to do something different. And then this puts you in the prime position to show them the new way. What do they need to do differently? And obviously, again, what they need to do differently is to buy your thing. But in a change message, you actually don't want to pitch product. In a change message, you want to pitch an approach, not a solution. Now, it just so happens that the only approach that is going to make sense in the story that you framed up is delivered by your solution, but that piece comes later when you do your capability pitch. But this is how you create the case for change. But you don't need to just generate interest. You also need them to be anxious enough to act. So that's where the why now piece of the equation comes in. So you need to instill urgency, and you do so first and foremost by detailing or revealing or connecting your unconsidered need to a business issue that's current and relevant to your prospect, to your prospect's industry. And then close out your message by demonstrating the impact that your recommended change is going to have on their business, on their world. And you do this by sharing a case study, by sharing an example, or simply, you know, painting a vision of what better looks like in their world, as long as you make sure that you connect it back to the business issue that you began with. And I just talked a lot, but Scott, I know that you've been through this process of building this message, and I think folks would be interested in hearing your experience in this area.
Yeah, we were very fortunate to be able to work with your team to develop our why change, why now message. You know, given my experience in sales, the number one competitor is the status quo or no decision. And then after that, it's your traditional competitors. And so this is actually a sales training slide right here, because this is what sales needs to be able to do as well. And that kind of supports that continuity of message. And then there are things that you have to measure, right? So marketing can measure all types of interactions and engagement with content, but sales typically doesn't actually record message consumption or any of the situational relevant features that you discuss or messaging that you discuss. And you lose that continuity almost immediately. So we've actually taken the work that was output from you guys, we're pushing it through all content and through all sales cadences. And this is the beginning of where I started to develop this this consolidation or this convergence capability, and that's how we're building our our go-to-market all the way through to customer. And then because we're a services firm, we're teaching this situational relevance and messaging to be reinforced with our services delivery team and then customer support folks. This is really a place that you can measure different consumption time frames. You can begin to create efficiencies in how you develop your content and get it to market.
Yeah, that's great. And so again, that's an acquisition message, but the situation changes radically when you're doing customer marketing and you want them to keep doing business with you, when you want them to renew a contract or re-up for a subscription. Now, in this case, status quo bias is your best friend and means that you want to reinforce it every step of the way. So how do you do that? You do that first and foremost by referencing the progress that they've made toward their goals by working with you. So this is where, again, sales and marketing need to really work together to figure out, what types of metrics are being tracked, what type of results strategically are they looking for, what were those original goals, and how are you doing in tracking toward those goals? You also want to reference the decision process that they went through to choose you. And you do this for two reasons. First, because you want to reassure them that they did their due diligence, that they made the right decision, it was wise, it was well reasoned. But you also kind of want to subtly remind them that it was also a really painful process. And it's probably not something that they necessarily want to revisit, especially if they feel like they did it right the first time. The next thing that you want to do is you actually want to make change seem unappealing. And you do this by making it seem risky and scary and expensive. So even if a competitor is coming in and offering a lower entry price, change always comes with risk and change always comes with cost. So your job now is to show them that the status quo is way less costly and way less risky than the cost and risk of change. And then finally, the final thing that you need to do, and this is always the hardest thing for marketers to hear, you need to refrain in a renewal motion from introducing any revolutionary new capabilities that are going to get them or force them to look at their world in a different way. And that might prompt them to want to compare you to other vendors. So that's not to say that you don't get to talk about your competitive advances, but in a renewal motion, you only want to talk about your competitive advances to the extent that they put you at parity with the competition. Because the science shows that when all other things are equal, why would anybody want to go through the risk, the cost, the hassle of change if they're going to end up with something that's just like what they're already getting from you? Now, I know that's really counterintuitive, but we have tested this theory time and time again, and the research is really clear on this point. If you introduce a provocative, disruptive message during a renewal motion, it will actually increase the likelihood of them renewing with you by 10%. And that's not to say that you don't ever get to talk about your new stuff, but you do that during your regular customer marketing and not at the point where you just want them to re-up. So it's just a really important and subtle thing. And again, we're talking here about renewal, when you want somebody to buy the same thing from you that they've been buying all along. But Scott, you tell me as a seller, do you only ever want to keep selling the same thing? Or do you perhaps want to sell more things?
Well, clearly, from a renewal standpoint, you're selling some level of similarity, but you want to continue to show value to that client, and some of that value is going to be derived from some of the new things. You've got to remember that everybody is knocking on everybody's door. They are trying to break that status quo, and if you're not there and you're not demonstrating the value that you've delivered and overcome that change and the pain of that change, then you are suspect and opening yourself up to a flank attack from a competitor. So I want loyalty and advocacy, through that standpoint, and that's the way and how you need to deliver value.
Yeah, and to do that, you need to introduce change, right? Because like you said, to continue delivering value, you've got to continue delivering new stuff. You've got to build and grow and expand that relationship. And most organizations do this through upselling and cross-selling, and even transitioning people to new solutions and new platforms. And this is the trickiest of the message choreographies that you're going to see, because a why evolve message, that upsell message, implies some bit of change. You want them to change, but the trick is you want them to change with you, not change away from you. So that's why we call this a hybrid message, because in a why evolve message, some of it is a change message and some of it is a stay message. So you introduce a why evolve message the same way you did your stay message, by reinforcing status quo bias and documenting results. So you then want to introduce a little bit of disruption into their world, because their world is changing around them all the time. And you introduce these evolving pressures, new threats, new stresses, new opportunities that didn't exist or weren't on their radar when they first started to engage with you. And then here you need to actually exhibit a little bit of vulnerability, because you were part of the status quo that they now are living in, and you're asking them to move away from that status quo. So you wouldn't be a good partner if you didn't share hard truths with them. And the hard truth is that they're no longer well positioned with the solution that they originally bought from you to meet these new evolving pressures. There's a risk to not changing, but there's also an upside to changing as well, to making the change. And as their trusted partner who alerted them to the evolving pressures, who shared the hard truths, showed the risks, who better to make that change with than you? So one of the things that you're going to see here is that the why evolve message relies very heavily on the established relationship that you have with your customer. So even if that relationship hasn't been perfect, there's still an emotional connection. Your customer has invested in your solution. They've invested time, money, credibility, and it's important to them to maintain that relationship as well. And this is, again, in the research and the simulations that we did at Corporate Visions, this is the type of upsell message that resonates most closely with customers. So Scott, any other additional thoughts on that?
So the worst thing that you could possibly do if you're in a renewal type of situation is at the last minute say, hey, you know, are you going to renew? And oh, by the way, we have all these new features and deliver all this new value. And your customers already heard that from the market because they're out there, they're getting advertising pushed in, you know, their various social feeds. And so then they wonder why you didn't tell them, you know, that the things have changed. And that's that share hard truth. And so if you've effectively created and executed this framework from the beginning of the buy cycle to the customer continuity area, you can avoid that.
Yeah.
I saw a stat recently that, you know, the number one thing companies want from their vendors is the innovation. What is coming, you know, in the future? What should I be preparing for? And that helps solidify that, you know, that relationship. And this is the message theory to do it with.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely right. And you know, the other advantage to using these types of frameworks, you know, other than the fact that once you get good at them, it makes it incredibly easy to create content in a systematic, repeatable way, is that these frameworks are based on buyer psychology. And what that means for you, whether you're a seller or a marketer, is that the science doesn't care whether you're a seller or marketer or in customer success, because the buyer psychology remains the same. So as long as you're using the right framework for the buyer situation, you're automatically speaking with one voice across the organization. And I think Scott and I both agree that having that single voice in such a disconnected and disjointed marketing world is critical to be able to continue to drive your business forward.
I couldn't agree more, Leslie. I think the last slide that you showed with the telephone games is an area of strategy that most of the folks we speak with are not considering. The motion is buy technology and then figure out how you're going to put your message and your communications on top of that various technology. But I think that this type of framework, the continuity of one voice, should dictate the way technology is selected, configured, and deployed, because that's the best way to create scale for your customers.
Yeah. And so we talked about frameworks, but so here's the thing about marketing frameworks. You don't just want to create a great marketing framework and hang it on a wall and gaze upon it, right? You actually want to use it. You want to use it to create content assets. And this, again, is a place where marketers struggle with memorability, and they've told us this. I work really hard on the content that I create. You work really hard on the content you create. And we all want to believe in our hearts that that content has an impact. But in our survey, 87% said that they're unsure or don't believe that their audience acts on their content. Ouch, that really hurts. The thing is, they're right. So according to science, an audience is only going to remember 10% of your message 48 hours after you deliver to them. And what's worse, the 10% that they often do remember is completely random. So here's the thing, you can't get your audience to remember any more than 10%. You just can't. But what you can do and what you need to do is you need to control the 10% that they do remember. You need to direct their attention to it. You need to continually repeat it. And you need to make sure that they have it in their memory when it comes time to make that buying decision. So this is what we talk about when we talk about having that 10% message. And this is just a quick example of how you can use that concept in a business presentation. So notice in this presentation that you've got your 10% message that is positioned and repeated at different strategic points in the presentation. And notice also that it looks different from the other slides around it. Making it stand out and continually repeating it helps make that message more memorable. And, you know, full transparency, one of the things that you might have noticed or you'll notice now is that there's a 10% message in this presentation too, and you've seen it 4 times already. See if you can count how many more times you're going to see it before the end of this presentation. But just having this repeatable 10% message is incredibly important. And just a few other techniques that that you can use to make your content more memorable. Scott, when you give a presentation, when you see a seller give a presentation, what is the first slide that they always lead with?
It's always the agenda, right? You get taught from an early age to tell them what you're going to tell them.
Yeah.
An agenda slide with lists just like that.
Yeah, and so here's what happens when you open with the agenda slide. Think about your audiences and think about your audience's brains as being very lazy organs. So in the olden days when people used to go into a presentation, but even when you're presenting online, the slide comes up, the lights go down, the brain sees the agenda slide that they've seen 500,000 times before, and the brain immediately goes to sleep, right? The beginning of a presentation is prime real estate in your prospect's brain, and it always astounds me how many people waste that prime real estate by showing the audience something that they've already seen a million times from a million different vendors. So you can replace that boring and predictable agenda slide with concrete, more action-oriented phrases that promise a reward. What are you going to get? What are you going to give your audience as a reward for sitting through that presentation? You see here that we simply rewrote these agenda bullets into specific things that the buyer is going to do or experience or learn as a result of viewing the presentation. So when you win their attention in this way, you win a place in their memory. And you can do the same thing with your title slides as well. There is nothing inaccurate about this title slide. This is what they're going to learn about in this presentation, right? But even making a simple change and adding a little bit of irreverence to this title and promising this reward instantly forces the brain to have to process that information differently. And when you force the brain to process information differently, it encodes into the memory. And that's what you want to do for the presentation. So Scott, any comments on that?
Well, this is the nail on the head. If anyone here can think back to the most recent meeting, which was probably a couple minutes ago, the phone is out. People are, connected to that thing like a tether, or the laptops are open. And if you haven't grabbed them right in the beginning, then you've lost that attention span. And that's face to face, right? That's in a conference room. So now imagine it's digital and you've got all these things going off. Your Outlook is flashing, your Microsoft Teams is flashing, somebody's Skyping you or Slacking you or asking questions, and so attention is even harder to maintain now than it was before.
Yeah. So again, that's why second skill to remember as a marketer is to create assets that grab your audience attention, keep them engaged, and stick in their minds long enough to influence their decisions. And you do that by identifying and controlling that 10%. But how do you do that? How do you do that with the assets? You need great visuals in your great assets, especially in a world where everything is now happening virtually and remotely. Most organizations that we work in our survey, 57% of them said that they've got official brand guidelines that are supposed to govern the visuals that get created. But how do you know what you produce is good design? So much marketing content looks alike, and it is really uninspiring. So you get your bullet lists and boxes, you get your stock photos of a businessman looking worried, or people in unnatural poses, or doing weird things, or shaking hands. Or you get kind of the simplistic smart art that is supposed to make slides and make information easier to consume. But what's interesting is that the easier that you make information to consume, the less complexity that's there, the harder it is for the brain to actually hold on to it. So you actually need to add a little bit of complexity to your visuals to make the brain work a little bit harder. So how do you make your visuals inspiring? How do you make your visuals inspire people to take action? The good news is that there are scientific principles that you can follow to visualize everything from basic facts to abstract concepts. And that is incredibly good news for people like me, because I am responsible in my organization for driving visual storytelling, but I'm not a graphic designer. I don't have an artistic bone in my body, but because I understand the science And because I know like what those principles are, it's easy for me to look at what my designers produce and be able to say yes or no based on my knowledge of that science. So because this is about visuals, the best way to talk about visuals is to visualize them. So I just want to show you some before or afters to show you the difference. And then Scott, I'll circle back with you because I really want to hear about your experience as a seller when you've got a presentation that you know is grabbing your audience, engaging them visually versus not. But let's take a look at this one for just a second. Nothing inaccurate here. There is, there's text and boxes, text boxes and words on the slide, and everything on here is accurate. But even adding a simple image that's relatable to people and arranging your text a little bit differently can actually make this message much more memorable. And all we did here was just add relevant images to these concepts without having to change the words. This is what you're looking at right here, my second least favorite stock photo of all time. My least favorite stock photo all time, I mentioned before, is the businessman looking worried. If you run an iStock search for worried businessman, you're going to come up with hundreds and thousands of examples. But my second least favorite stock photo is happy person looking at phone, and that's what we have here. So the reason why I dislike this so much is because the world is full of stock photos of happy people looking at phones. And one way to not be memorable is to use the same image that your competitors are using or that your audience has seen hundreds of thousands of times before. So in full disclosure, this was actually a CBI presentation. It was a first draft presentation that we got from a designer, and it was supposed to be a background for a quarterly business review. The running theme through that presentation was that the customer is in the middle of a story that is still unfolding. So instead of using this predictable image, what we did was intersperse little origami elements throughout this entire presentation to very subtly reinforce that metaphor of folding and unfolding. And we were able to do that and make the presentation stand out and look different without going too overboard on the metaphor. And often just adding creative little elements like this makes all the difference in elevating your presentation. And so here's another example of how you can make a title slide memorable by capturing attention using intense visuals. So what you have here is an image that's totally unexpected. So all of a sudden the brain is going to wake up and say, whoa, what is this thing I'm seeing? This doesn't look like a PowerPoint. And that's the idea. So you want to deliver PowerPoints that don't look like PowerPoints because, again, what's different is what people are going to remember. And that's how you start to take control of what people do remember by making it look different and making it stand out. Another quick way to grab attention is by moving away from what's safe and predictable. Again, this image here, there is nothing dangerous about this. It's a hand holding a phone. How many times have we seen this before? But look at what happens when we actually take the concept of fuel and oil and change it up and make it look a little bit differently. All of a sudden, you've got something that's much more provocative and much more memorable. And then this final image takes what is an abstract concept, and I've been doing business presentations for 20 years, and business presentations are full of abstract concepts. But look what happens when you take this abstract concept and you bring it to life in a human context. Not expected, not something you'd expect to see in a business presentation, and that's what makes it powerful and memorable because there's emotion associated with it. And you can hear more about emotion in just a second. But Scott, I just love to hear your perspective and your experiences on what it's like to be a seller presenting visually and what you've taken away from all that.
Well, first and foremost, I'm guilty as charged. I've been a master of these terrible PowerPoint bullet lists. And you can literally see people reach for their phone anytime you bring up a phone, right? Any mention of mobile, people say, oh, where's my, my Whoopee? Where's my phone? I got to check and see if there's anybody, coming in on Facebook or what's going on with work while this presentation goes on. And you see that in a face-to-face setting. And, you have an opportunity in that situation to change tone, ask questions, gather engagement, but you completely lose it in a digital environment. But you don't really know to what extent people are paying attention to what you're doing. But there's not a person in the world that's not going to feel emotion in that picture right there about connecting. And you've clearly reinforced, hey, I need to pay attention. This is different. And so I am guilty. I have to tell you, as I was
but you're not
preparing
going
for
to
the
do it
meeting,
anymore, are you?
absolutely not. I sent the deck out to my entire team before we did the webinar and said, hey guys, these are concepts that we have to incorporate into our deliverables. You know, we're a consulting firm, and if we're not making measurable moments and memorable moments, I mean, then our customer is not going to take the suggestions that we've actually done a lot of work to deliver. So
yeah,
I am in process of implementing that right there.
Yeah, I mean, because the whole point of creating business content is to spark action. You want people to remember to act, and using those memorable visuals is one of the fastest way connecting memory to action. Being able to do that is such a critical skill to be able to master. And the fourth skill that you need to master is the story that you tell. So there's been so much hype in the market, and has been for years, around this idea of business storytelling. Unfortunately, a lot of the business stories that get told aren't really the technical definition of stories, or they don't appeal to audiences in a way that actually gets them to make decisions. And that is because too many business stories are safe, they're rational, they're dry. They don't ignite the senses the way a good story should. And again, our results bear this out. So 70% of our survey respondents agreed or strongly agreed that their stories are based primarily on rational facts. The problem is that when you rely too much on rational facts in your stories, and you do that at the expense of the emotional component of the story, you're actually undercutting yourself, because you're actually removing what is the real power of great storytelling, which is the emotion. And the good news here, again, is that stories follow science-based rules too. And when you give the brain the right elements, it will encode the story so that your buyer will remember it and remember to act on it. And there's 3 pillars to business storytelling that you can follow to create better business stories. And the first, they are perceptive, cognitive, and affective. So what do I mean by perceptive? Perceptive is the ability to create and demonstrate sensitive insight. Essentially what that means is making sure that you're using both words and pictures to incorporate elements that an audience can experience with their senses, things that they can see, smell, feel, hear. Context includes where and when the story takes place. So who's the main character of this story? In corporate visions world, you'll hear us tell you that the main character of your story, the hero of your story, is always the customer. So you want to tell a story about this customer. And action across time means that in your business story, something needs to happen. When you do nothing, people feel nothing. But when you do something, or you have your main character do something, they're going to feel something back. Now, the second pillar is cognitive. And as we said before, this is where most business stories live right now. But this is related to intellectual activity, reasoning, facts, information. But facts are really hard to remember on their own. So you can help your audience recall facts better by balancing them with perceptive elements, because when you attach a fact to a perceptive element, it encodes it in the memory more. And then affect is related to attitudes, feelings, and moods. So to create and include the affective pillar in your storytelling, think about emotions, think about values, think about motivations. Emotion is a critically strong pathway to memory. When make your audience feel something when they listen to or view or hear your content. And just, when I talk about emotion, I mean, I'm talking about something maybe as simple as loss aversion. That's a powerful motivator. If you're able to build a sense of loss into the story, people are going to be 2 to 4 times more likely to move away from a perceived loss than they would be to move toward a perceived gain. So always want to make sure that you're describing your emotions, you're describing your capabilities, you're describing your what better looks like in a way that makes your audience feel viscerally and emotionally what that emotion will feel like. So the best stories contain all 3 of these elements, but really good storytellers know how to dial up or dial down different components or different elements, kind of like if you've got kind of those old sound mixers on a radio where you turn like kind of one up, you turn the bass up, you turn the treble down, and go back and forth. What you'll hear from me is that the more perceptive and affective elements you incorporate, the stronger your story is going to be. So if you're tempted to just tell a story that's based primarily on just the facts, ma'am, see how you can spice it up with better descriptions, with more concrete examples, and with examples that actually grab people by the heart and by the gut. And Scott, do you see a lot of this in the conversations that you have with your customers?
Absolutely. I think here is, one of the areas where sales can provide some relevant input to marketing, because they're actually pretty good at relating via the story model, right? They can reference a similar customer, they can reference a similar challenge, and how that customer overcame that. So they actually, being in the field directly, can contribute to the overall development. But I think they can also improve in the sense that they are, situationally relevant and are able to deliver the story according to the framework.
Yeah. And then, the other thing about stories is that you can use them in a bunch of different ways. So you can have a story that stands on its own, or you can actually incorporate it into a broader piece of content, almost like a sidekick, to make your 10% message even more memorable. And one effective way to organize a presentation is, you remember you saw the slide before about the 10% message, you can actually insert a story right before you deliver that 10% message to make that more concrete and more memorable. And this is an example of what we did for one of our clients. So we were working with one of the world's most widely recognized provider of stock imagery and video in the world. And the story that they wanted to tell was all about how creative directors and marketing executives could use their services to free up creative teams to do what they did best. So the 10% message was free your storytellers to tell your stories. And that was a great 10% message. But this customer also had some great customer examples. They had great references that directly supported that 10% message. So we front-ended each 10% message, each repetition of that, with a customer story that illustrated and reinforced what that 10% message was. So again, the skill that you need to learn here is, how do you wrap everything in a great area, in a great narrative that uses neuroscience principles to build and tell the best stories for memory, decision, and action. And you do that through balancing your perceptive, cognitive, and affective elements of stories. So I just, kind of wanted to just reiterate for just a second again that as a marketer, you're expected to engage with customers further and further down the funnel. It means that you need the right framework, whether you're talking to a new customer or an existing prospect. It means that you've got to bring that message to life in great content assets that really hammer in on that 10% message. It means that you've got to use wonderful visuals to create designs that spark action. And it means that you've got to wrap everything in a great narrative that uses neuroscience principles to build and tell the best stories for memory, decision, and action. And we're going to break for questions now from both me and Scott. But I just wanted to say that if anybody is paying attention, you've actually seen my 10% slide 10 times in this presentation, just in case. And so I'm going to open this up for questioning now. And Sala, I don't know if people have been typing anything into the chat, but if you wanted to share, and I think Scott and I will come back on camera.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, thanks, Leslie and Scott. We do have a few questions that have come through. And just as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane, so please continue to do so. Or if you prefer to contact us afterwards, that's of course absolutely fine as well. And just as a reminder, again, you will be receiving the recording afterwards, so no worries about that. So the first question is that we have, with marketing taking over more of the funnel, how do you see the role of business development changing?
So I can take the first part of that, and Scott, you can chime in. But as we said, what we see is business development is coming more and more over to marketing, because one of the big things that I think that you need to do in business development is you need to measure. You need to see how your cadences are working. You need to adapt your processes. You need to be able to move really quickly and really nimbly. And because marketing has become so technology oriented, especially over the last 10 years, marketing's already got the systems in place to do that tracking and to do that analysis. And Scott, I don't know if you see the same thing.
Yeah, I do. You know, business development is one of those monikers or titles that covers a lot of different effort. It could be outbound, it could be inbound response, it could be just setting up appointments for a field sales group. So you have to analyze what is exactly the role that you have them in, what is their metric, how are they rewarded, and then insert into your scripting or into your knowledge base this messaging, right? They need to reinforce the memorable moments that were, as you can see in Leslie's broken out presentation, initiated, whether it be through advertising, through a presentation, through a webinar like this, to reignite that memorable moment and move them forward into a conversation, whether digitally or directly with sales, so they consider making a change of the status quo.
Oh, yeah, and that makes absolute sense and kind of ties in nicely to our next question, which is about, after creating all these great stories, how do you then make sure that teams further on, like sales and customer success, stick to that stories? And Scott, this probably works well into your sales background. What are your thoughts?
Role play, role play, role play, role play. You know, it's so easy to get taken off message, you know, during the questions when you're speaking with customers or prospective customers. And so you've got to learn how to definitely re-engineer the conversation back to a memorable moment. And so, you know, in my career, it's been a variety of different role plays. And early on, I don't know if it's still taught, but video yourself. You know, video yourself actually communicating this message, whether you're going to be in a meeting face-to-face or digitally. You know, continually work on improving your message and try to understand the emotional response that you're seeking to elicit. Confirm it, record it, and move the prospects or the customers forward.
Yeah, and I would say I wouldn't underestimate the value of coaching in this as well. One of the things that we've seen in the way that sellers train is if you give your seller a story and they know that they're going to have to present it to someone, to a coach over video, what we've seen is that they will actually rehearse it 7 times, an average of 7 times before they actually submit their presentation. Whereas if they're just kind of practicing on their own, they might run through it once or twice. But giving some accountability to them, that you're going to have to tell this story to your manager, to your boss, to an outside consultant, whoever that is, they will actually work harder to learn that story.
Oh, thanks, guys. That makes.
Yeah, I think that's great advice.
Yeah, thank you. This is a question about, when it comes to creating these memorable materials, are there differences between industries, or if you're creating these decks for different teams, like does it affect the design?
So I can talk about that. Yeah, you know, I think it does. One of the things that just kind of a tip for creating a 10% slide, for example. One way to create a really memorable 10% slide is through context, by putting the background of that 10% slide into the context of your prospect's environment. So one of the things that you saw in my 10% slide is that it looked like a marketer's desktop, right? You got the cup of coffee, you got the yellow stickies, you got the iPad. That's a world that a marketer is going to find themselves familiar in. So if you're creating a message for manufacturing or something like that, you might want your background to be a factory floor. So there's different ways to make your message and your design more relevant to the industry. What I will say is that your core story is driven by customer context, but it also should hearken to your differentiation as well. So you want to always make sure that whatever story it is that you're telling, you're bringing them back to your differentiated approach to solving that challenge. So what we found is that the core story doesn't necessarily change that much based on industry, but the context in which you put that story and the details that you include might shift based on the industry.
Cool. No, that's really interesting. And you mentioned the 10% message. There's actually a question about that. And like, how can you define what that 10% should then be? Like, where do you, how do you go about it? How can you start thinking about it? Like, really getting down to what is it that you're really trying to get across?
So the question that we always ask, and I go back to the why change framework for just a second. The question that we always ask there is, what are they going to be able to do differently by working with you? So you've done this, you've surfaced this unconsidered need, you've exposed their flawed approach, you've created discomfort in their status quo. What are they going to be able to do differently by buying your thing? And if you can identify what that is the foundation of your 10% message. It's the action that they're going to be able to take that's different, that they can take with you than they could with anyone else.
Sounds good. And then also we spoke about the unconsidered need when it comes to a disruptive message. There's also a question about how can you go about figuring out an unconsidered need? I mean, it seems like a golden ticket, doesn't it? How, like, a problem that you can solve that no one else can solve. So how do you go about? Are there any tips to finding that out? What kind of research you can do? How you can go about it?
So I can tell you one thing that you shouldn't rely too heavily on is voice of the customer research, because the customers don't know what they don't know. And I know that that's kind of counterintuitive as well for the way sellers and marketers work, but there's this really old cliche saying that said that if Henry Ford had listened to voice of the customer research, he would have made faster horses versus making cars, right? So the way to kind of come up with an unconsidered need is to look again at your differentiation. What is it that you do that's different that the competition doesn't offer? And then attach your unconsidered need to that differentiation, because if you can solve that problem in a unique way, or if you have something unique that allows them to do something that they couldn't do with anyone else, that's that unconsidered need that you want to make them care about. So that's when I was talking about the underappreciated and unmet needs. It's getting them to care about what you want them to care about, and what you want them to care about is the stuff that only you can offer. So start with where you're differentiated, and you might not have a ton of differentiation, and that's okay. Just exploit as much as you can.
Yeah, I tag along on that and say that now a turnabout is fair play, right? If the buyers have been investigating and researching and skipping the beginning of the buy cycle, now you can research them and put together your, your differentiators and get your 10% identified through the various research.
Perfect, thank you. And then I know we're coming up on the hour, just a final question. What if your company is using like a really standard deck, and creating these memorable materials might be a hard push, shall we say, for now? What is something like a little thing someone can do to take something away today that they can put into effect starting tomorrow?
So this is such a great question to end with, and I'll tell you a couple things. And by the way, I threw up my the report on the screen right now. You can download this. It shows a lot of the science behind that. So you can actually start with the report. Show the science to the people who make these decisions, right? Show them that the science matters. But what I'd also say is this is where, if you're a marketer, you can enlist sales, because your best sellers know this stuff instinctively. They do this stuff instinctively. And when they get that from marketing and they go out and they're successful with it, they are going to be your strongest advocates. They're going to be the ones who are going to go to their managers and say, hey, I want more of that. Give me more of that. I had these results. And, Scott, I think this is a great question to end on, to talk about the partnership, but anything else to add?
I think that there are a lot of resources now to hire creative talent if you don't have a particularly creative group of people, and do the research, and clearly download this report, revisit and send out this link, and find a way to reignite emotion. We don't become less human when we go to work. It's not like we don our cape and now we're just logical people. We've got emotions and we buy similarly. And, from a marketing, sales, and customer service perspective, you've got to just really consider that these folks are human And your job is to elicit emotion, ignite questions, and start the dialogue.
Well said.
Thank you. Those are great words to end on. Yeah. So I think that's it for now. So we're just 2 minutes over. So I want to thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for attending today's webinar. If we were unable to get to your question or you have some more, please do send them over and we will get back to you individually afterwards. And yeah, on behalf of Leslie, Scott, and myself, thank you for joining and please have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Stay well.